When we were young, our parents brought us to the YMCA camp. Children, ever filled with imagination, would pass stories from one person to the next until we all whispered the same names and feared the same ghost. For me, the story of the dog man from the insane asylum was the big bad. He was the most realistic, and I hated that he preyed on one's sense of security. The dog man was a reminder that no matter how safe you thought that you were, a single missed lock could end you. My sister Ellen, on the other hand, was much braver than I was growing up, and she had a certain level of disrespect when it came to the rules. She watched scary movies to put herself to sleep, and instead of being scared of the boogeyman, she got a certain thrill out of terrorizing other kids with her stories. I remember one time at the Y summer camp, she killed the lights in the girls' bathroom while we were all changing into our swimwear. Have any of y'all ever heard of the story of Bloody Mary? She asked us all. A few people murmured no, and the ones who said yes seemed absolutely terrified at the name. Ellen felt encouraged by the response, and she told the story to them in her chilly, raspy voice. At the end, her voice crescendoed into a triumphant glee. And if anyone says her name 3 times in the mirror, she will appear, bloody with stains of her past victims, ready to take her next. The girls screamed and begged her to turn the lights back on, which of course she ignored. Who wants to try it? She can't take all of us. Some girl, I forget her name, began chanting Bloody Mary as we all started running towards the door, not wanting to be anywhere nearby just in case Bloody Mary was summoned through her call. Ellen tried to stop us, but a counselor came into the bathroom just in time and flipped the lights back on. Years later, Ellen would retell the tale and mock me for being afraid of some ghost story. She dared me to try it multiple times throughout her childhood, and she would laugh hysterically when I'd say no. She knew that asking me made me mad, and her constant insistence on us playing Bloody Mary made me that much more afraid of ghosts, making it so that I had to sleep with a nightlight even though I was a teen and no longer a child. Ellen grew silent and more distant as the years went by. She complained each time that I would stand up for myself against her, and she hated that my friends and boyfriends always took my attention away from her. "You're just not the same anymore," she would say in disgust. Ellen began looking for other forms of entertainment when she realized that I was no longer there for her. She snuck out of the house at night and was often caught by her parents and eventually the police. I didn't want to say it, but I thought that she had an addiction for thrill-seeking for attention. I felt bad that I wasn't there for her as often, but I had my own friends, and the more rebellious and strange that Ellen became, the less I wanted to be associated with her. I wasn't sure why she thought that she needed to try dangerous stunts, but every year she seemed to get a little bit worse than the year before, until eventually our parents gave up on her and sent her to a corrections home for her drug abuse. None of us heard from her after that. We weren't sure if she blamed us for how her life had played out, but as a family, we all thought that we had done what was best for her. That was until the police contacted us to report that she had died. We had been told initially that she had died from a heart attack that caused her to fall from the rooftop where she had been hanging out with friends. Reluctantly, we had accepted this answer, but the real shock for us came from a witness report. The witness stated that Ellen looked terrified moments before she began to fall. She seemed to be looking at some invisible force that no one else could see, and she trembled and stated the name Mary over and over and over again. There was no one associated with Ellen named Mary at the party, nor was there anyone in her life with that name. The police concluded that she had been talking about marijuana, but no part of me believed this, and I alone carried the burden of truth about her obsession over Bloody Mary.
A security guard at Milton High School held his job in the same way many people hold theirs. It sustained him, but he longed for something else. His days were spent watching over the students and teachers as they entered the school grounds, offering polite smiles to those who waved at him. While no one ever approached the security guard, he observed every detail about them. He noticed when someone was alone, which students were engaged in disputes, and could even discern those grappling with turmoil in their home lives. His heart ached for those students, but without concrete evidence, he could do little to assist them, so he often kept his distance. The only person he interacted with on a regular basis was the principal. Together they reviewed security footage when trouble arose or to resolve matters like the mystery of a stolen toy. However, he refrained from physical intervention that was the principal's role. If someone truly nefarious visited the school, the security guard would step in, though such occurrences were rare. While he occasionally roamed the school's halls, he primarily confined himself to the office. The school boasted about 50 cameras, some in plain sight and others hidden, creating a sense of safety while deterring those who believed they could engage in misconduct unnoticed. The security guard had installed additional cameras unbeknownst to the principal, but he believed it was all in the spirit of their agreement. More cameras meant a higher likelihood of catching particularly egregious behavior. One Tuesday, while monitoring the screens, the security guard focused on Miss Amber Jean. Amber Jean, a woman in her mid-20s, had a penchant for choosing the wrong men. Her last boyfriend, Larry, lasted longer than the others. It took 5 months before her makeup started getting heavier and her eyes started becoming noticeably puffy. One time she even came to school with a particularly nasty shiner that she could not hide well. The day after that, she had a cheap ring that he had bought her from Walmart on her left ring finger. The security guard was worried for Miss Amber Jean, and although he never caught her fiancé being abusive to her on camera, he was able to catch him cheating on her with another teacher. He showed the footage of the cheating to the principal and told him about his other concerns. The principal listened, and he agreed that Larry was a person that they needed to take care of in their own special way. Police reports stated that Larry was a missing person that likely ran away due to the multiple felony convictions that he already had on him. But the security guard and the principal knew the truth. They stalked him, memorized his schedule, and made their plan of retribution for a day when he was most likely to be home alone. The security guard's stomach rumbled with glee as he remembered the delicacy of Larry's flesh. Larry had been in poor physical condition, which had made him ripe and tender. The principal and him had feasted on that delicacy for weeks, and he was hopeful that he would find a new wrongdoer to feed on again soon.
I didn't think much of it at the time, although now I kind of question my intent. Every day I wrote my pain onto paper, and each day my story was reborn. It started off so minor, a simple outlet for my sanity's sake. On the piece of paper, I wrote and imagined myself, but it wasn't me. It was somebody else who experienced my pain. I took my anguish, my troubling thoughts, my depression, all out on her. Her life's disarray, all the terrible things that I made happen to her gave me a sort of rush of excitement. It felt good to know that somebody else was suffering and that it wasn't just me. No matter how bad my life got, the girl in my stories was always worse off. I dreamt of the girl in my imagination quite often, and in my dreams, she always seemed so real as she came up to me with pleading, doe eyes and begged me to stop writing about her. I felt for her as I watched her get on her hands and knees and beg at me as if I were some sort of god to her that could control her life. And I suppose that I could, but she wasn't real. And although I felt for her, I truly did. But if I didn't take things out on her, then how could I get my own feelings to stop? I never really questioned what I penned or what I did to her through my imagination. She wasn't real. She was my outlet. She was just some figment of my imagination. And I was right to think of her that way, wasn't I? She was someone for whom the horror of my reality transformed into something tangible that I could see and interact with. It was concrete as opposed to the feelings in my head that didn't make sense. With her, I knew why she was hurting. I knew the things that caused her pain. All of my pain, it was just psychological. I could point to different things in my life that made me sad, but not all of it made sense. There wasn't just one demon, but for her, that one demon was me, the author. That was until I started to talk to this girl in my class a bit more. She would tell me about the things happening in her life, and I would listen with a sort of odd horror as I realized that everything happening to her matched my writing exactly. Could it have been that I actually had some dominion over the life of somebody else? And if that were true, is there somebody out there who is causing all of these terrible things to happen to me? I can feel myself going mad with these thoughts as I try to think about the best way to break myself free.
The velvety shadows were our comfort as we began our late-night task. Our customers had deep pockets, not just in money, but also in influence and power. Although we still had to be careful as not to be caught, the desire that our customers had for the rare commodities that only we were bold enough to acquire helped us in our pursuit. My brother and I never sought out this line of work, but now that so many years have passed, we take a certain pride in knowing that we are the best living crafters at our particular craft. Neither of us would have initially sought out this profession for ourselves, and at first we felt incredibly apprehensive about the whole ordeal. But we now see it for the artistry that it is, and we feel a certain pride in our work. We attribute the way that our lives turned out to a singular moment in the past. A few years back, we would perform casual robberies of middle-class homes. We had gotten fairly good at it, and we thought that we would try our hand at stealing from the rich. The first home that we went to was the Wynor Mansion, We had unrightfully assumed that the place would be empty because it was allegedly haunted, and no one ever saw the proprietor of the estate leave the home, and the town had assumed that he had died and become one of the haunts. The proprietor, Robert Wynor, however, turned out to be a shut-in who was particularly protective of his ancestral home. Although it worked out in our favor, looking back now, our ordeal to steal and sell the items from Wynor Mansion seemed that much more of a ludicrous plan. Stealing from the homes of the middle class was simple enough. The items in their homes were nice, but they weren't so unique that the origins would be known. Stealing from the rich, however, was a gamble. The items that they had were incredibly rare. If they were to notice that anything was missing, then it'd be too easy for the police to search pawn shops and for who had sold the item, or worse, who had posted it on eBay or Amazon for a quick buck. What Robert Wynor did, instead of reporting us to the police, was to give us an offer. He gave us an option to steal for him in exchange for not reporting him to the police. We agreed without asking about conditions and signed a contract with him, agreeing to do the act. I'd like to think that we'd know better now than to say yes to an assignment without reading, but that's neither here nor there nowadays. My brother and I were young, naive, and bold back then. We felt as if agreeing to steal for an old man would be a simple task, and we felt as if we'd won the lottery by not only avoiding prison, but also being given the opportunity to be paid to steal. I don't really know why we agreed to follow through with the assignment after we learned of its true nature, however. My brother and I have created this idea over our whole profession, if you will, that we are better than those that ask for the material that we steal for our customers, and that we would never do such terrible deed if it wasn't for our customers. We like to ignore that we have always had a choice in stealing what we steal, and that we could just accept our punishment and go to prison instead. But we don't allow ourselves to see that as an option. The more crimes we commit, the more we grow afraid of the punishment. We feel like slaves, forced and bound by the decision to steal for Robert Minor all those years ago. We blame Robert Weiner for introducing us to his friends who all wanted the same product. We blame their demands for us to learn how to craft using the material on Robert. We blame Robert Weiner for basically everything good and bad that has ever happened in our lives from that moment onwards. The truth, of course, is that we get a sort of thrill out of stealing the way we do. There's something so fascinating about stealing something that no one else would dare to steal. It's amazing just how much the people that we steal from keep on their person. It's not like they even need it anymore. The items we steal are often worth fortunes on their own. Tearing the embalmed flesh off of the cadavers is a pain, and neither my brother nor I feel completely comfortable doing so after all these years, but in a lot of ways we have gotten used to it. The more that we have studied the craft and history of anthropomorphic bibliography, the more fascinated and desensitized we have grown to our field of work. We've learned that the fresher the body, the easier the job is for us, and the easier it is to work with their skin as a material. By the time that we are done with the process of adding the chemicals to it and morphing the material, the books bound in human skin feel no different than the books made from the skin of any other animal. Only our customers and future forensics teams would be able to tell the difference between the items in our customers' collection that are made from humans versus animals. But for our customers, although the difference is hard to tell, them knowing that they have something as rare as a book covered in human skin in their private collection that is so rare that hardly anyone else has seen, much less held in their hands, is worth more to them than gold. Tonight we return to our grave-robbing brothers, who made a profession out of crafting human skin into books. What the clients did not know was that in order for the brothers to make more pristine products, The freshness of the corpse was of the utmost importance. They had tried to be as humanitarian as possible about the whole ordeal. After all, it's not as if they had a choice in their dealings. They had signed a contract, after all. They had tried to use bodies that had been buried for a while, the ones who were the least likely to be missed. But through trial and error, they learned that the older the corpse, the harder it was for them to complete their task of crafting skin into leather. Their clients, although understanding at first, had started becoming quite demanding. They had no respect over how much the brothers were having to learn, and they were particularly rude at first when months of waiting yielded inferior results. They refused to pay and demanded that the brothers try again and again and again until the product was impeccably pristine. Eventually, the brothers became better at the craft of anthropodermic bibliopegy, but they needed a way of expediting the process. The flesh was wasteful to them with the embalming liquid inside of it. It was difficult to work with, but finding a buried, non-embalmed, and non-brittle body to work with was difficult and only increased their chances of getting caught. They needed a plan, and Cain knew just what to do as he followed the advice of his namesake. He'd never kill his real brother, but his brother in Christ was a different ordeal altogether. Although they had worked with so many corpses, Eric wasn't sure if he agreed with Cain that murder was an equal act. Cain took the initiative, and after Eric worked with the skin, he realized that the questionable moral was worth the quality of the product, although he did conclude that Cain would have to do the deed. The brothers needed a way of disposing the corpses without detection. They thought about burning them, but they were afraid of the odor. They thought about burying them in the graves of the ones that were now empty, but they knew that they'd soon run out of room, and after realizing how valuable the flesh could be, discarding the rest of the body seemed like such a waste. Cain and Eric dived deeper into the realm of research and discovered more uses for the recently deceased. They had expected there to be a morbid curiosity market for the meat and for the organs, but they hadn't expected the vast demand for the blood. Blood, as they came to understand, has a strong mythos behind it. It's been believed for centuries that the blood of the deceased has medicinal properties dating as far back as gladiators fighting in ancient Rome, where the blood of gladiators was thought to offer a cure for epilepsy. The blood of those killed in France by guillotine had also been noted to be consumed. The bloodier and gorier the death, the more powerful the blood. They even found a specific recipe by a Franciscan for the creation of a medicinal jam made from the blood back in 1679. From that recipe, they determined that the best blood came from people of warm, moist, temperate, such as those of a blotchy red complexion and rather plump of build. Not wanting to waste the opportunity, Cain and Eric followed the advice of the old Franciscan and left the blood out until it congealed into a sticky mass, and then spread it onto a soft wood table, cutting thin slices out of it to allow for the watery part to drip away. Once it was dried out, they would put the slices on the stove and stir it until it turned into a batter-like consistency, then transferred it into a warm bronze mortar and pounded through a sieve into a glass jar. The jam turned out to be a success, and since the jam needed to be renewed each spring, they managed to make a returning profit. The customers swore that a bit of the jam was enough to cure the worst of their headaches and made them feel younger than ever before. The brothers became as skilled of jam makers as they were at skin binding, that they began selling the products to locals who were not as knowledgeable as the others. To the townsfolk, the jam was just a magic herb, and the expensive leather-bound books were made of animals. By the time that Robert Weiner died and their contract with them had finally come to pass, the brothers had killed over 60 folks and were known best for their artisan crafts. The secret of their source died with their customers, and the brothers enjoyed a rich, happy, and early retirement where no one was ever the wiser of the true tragic origin of their goods. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like a fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear you in his sight. You are 10,000 times as abominable in his eyes as the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. You have offended him infinitely, more than ever a stubborn rebel did his prince, and yet it is nothing but his hand that holds you from falling into the fire every moment. It is to be ascribed to nothing else that you do not go to hell the last night that you were suffered to wake again in this world, after you closed your eyes to sleep, and there is no other reason to be given why you have not dropped into hell since you arose in the morning, but that's God's hand that has helped you up. There is no other reason to be given why you have not gone to hell since you have sat here in the house of God, provoking his pure eye by your sinful, wicked manner of attending his solemn worship. Yea, there is nothing else that is to be given as a reason why you do not this very moment drop down into hell. O sinner, consider the fearful danger you are in. It is a great furnace of wrath, a wide and bottomless pit, full of the fire of wrath that you are held over in the hand of God, whose wrath is provoked and increased as much against you as against many of the damned in hell. You hang by a slender thread, with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it, and ready every moment to singe it and burn it asunder. It would be dreadful to suffer this fierceness and wrath of Almighty God one moment, but you must suffer it to all eternity. There will be no end to this exquisite, horrible misery. When you look forward, you shall see along forever a boundless duration before you, which will swallow up your thoughts and amaze your soul. And you will absolutely despair of ever having any deliverance, any end, any mitigation, any rest at all. You will know certainly that you must wear out long ages, millions of ages, in wrestling with this almighty, merciless vengeance. And then, when you have so done, when so many ages have actually been spent by you in this manner, you will know that all is but a point to what remains, so that your punishment will indeed be infinite. Oh, who can express what the state of a soul in such circumstance is? All that we can possibly say about it gives but a very feeble, faint representation of it. It is inexpressible and inconceivable, for who knows the power of God's anger? How dreadful is the state of those that are daily and hourly in danger of this great wrath and infinite misery! But this is the dismal case of every soul in this congregation that has not been born again, however moral and strict, sober and religious that they may otherwise be. Oh, that you would consider it, whether you be young or old. There is reason to think that there are many in this congregation now hearing this discourse that will actually be the subject of this very misery to all eternity. We know not who they are, or in what seats they sit, or what thoughts they now have. It may be they are now at ease, and hear all these things without much disturbance, and are now flattering themselves that they are not the persons, promising themselves that they shall escape. If we knew that there was one person, and but one in the whole congregation, that was to be the subject of this misery, what an awful thing it would be to think of. If we knew who it was, what an awful sight would it be to see such a person. How might the rest of the congregation lift up a lamentable and bitter cry over him? But, alas! Instead of one, how many is it likely will remember this discourse in hell? And it would be a wonder if some that are now present should not be in hell in a very short time before this year is out. And it would be no wonder if some persons that now sit here in some seats of this meeting house, in health and quiet and secure, should be there before tomorrow morning.
Although she was a professor of demonology, Eileen did not personally believe in the existence of otherworldly beings. She would pretend, for the sake of her students and for the sake of discourse with her colleagues. But the longer she studied these entities, the more firm of a skeptic she became in her own field. She had been raised a Christian, and although she felt a genuine connection to her faith in her earlier years, the older and more studied she became, the angrier and eventually more passive she became over faith as a whole. She hated the teachings that had made her fear both the thought of eternal damnation and of a wrathful God. The thought of Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and other usages of hellfire as a means to usher people into servitude of a higher being, made her anxious instead of thankful. Initially, Eileen had started off as a theology major at a private Christian university, but the more that she learned about other religions and how they also incorporated demonology in their culture, the more she began to shift her fear of hell into an understanding of the nature of fear and anxiety that comes as a natural part of living. And she began recognizing that her anxieties were only being perpetuated through her faith. She eventually dismissed her faith altogether and shifted her focus from Christian theology to the study of demonology as a collective through a wider lens. The more she learned about the horrible, terrifying realms of purported reality, the calmer she became. Over the years, her anxiety that she pinned on her upbringing developed into her theory that demons, hell, and the whole concept of damnation were all simply coping mechanisms to help humans cope with terrible circumstances in life. She did not blame others for having faith in higher beings, but for herself, she was perfectly content with her own atheistic view. That was until she started working on her latest research. Throughout history, it is common for books to be lined with curses for anyone who may steal the book. Prior to the printing revolution, the ownership of books was seen as a privilege unbeknownst to many. Because books were so coveted, it was not uncommon for a curse to be transcribed within the pages to invoke the curse of the gods to help protect books and scrolls. Often found in the colophon, the curses were the last line of defense to help ensure that the books were not stolen, dating back so far, if not earlier than, the reign of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, from 668 to 627 BC. An example of one of the curses that he had marked into a book was as follows: I have transcribed upon tablets the noble products of the work of the scribe, which none of the kings who have gone before me had learned, together with the wisdom of Nabu, in so far as it existeth. I have arranged them in classes, I have revised them, and I have placed them in my palace, that I, even I, the ruler, who knoweth the light of Ashur, the king of the gods, may read them. Whosoever shall carry off this tablet, or shall inscribe his name on it, side by side with mine own, may Ashur and Belit overthrow him in wrath and anger, and may they destroy his name and posterity in the land. The research that Eileen was working towards was to determine the validity of these curses, their longevity, and the relationship between rulers and the demons. Eileen put in several favors with other scholars until she was able to get her hands on an allegedly cursed book that promised to evoke the wrath of Lamashtu, a Mesopotamian demon whose reputation no one would dare to evoke. Back in Mesopotamian times, a person's legacy fell on the offspring. Only if they had children who carried on their name would their deeds be remembered. Lamashtu's wickedness was well known to disturb sleep and bring nightmares, kill foliage, infest bodies of water, bind the muscles of men, bring about disease and sickness, and most morbidly, she would cause women to miscarry. Eileen, in her scholarly point of view, was not a believer in curses, let alone the demons who could carry them out. The thought of a miscarriage was a sad, terrible thought, and Eileen understood the need that mothers and communities would prefer to hold onto in order to explain such a sad happening. It was better, Eileen supposed, to have someone or something to blame for their suffering, as opposed to feeling the shame themselves when they did not have a better explanation, as we do now. Eileen, while working on her research, began to feel a sense of uneasiness come over her, but she dismissed it initially. It was all superstitious nonsense, she reminded herself, and she tried to put her misgivings and her creeping anxieties to bed. But her feelings of unease followed her there as she began to have horrific nightmares, and she dreamt of those that she loved being tortured to death by all the demons that she had ever studied. She dropped the research project altogether and returned the book. She thought that she would feel better after returning the book, but the feeling of uneasiness and the sensation that something sinister was lurking over her continued to grow like an ominous shadow. She remembered Legion, she remembered Asog, Lilu, Alu, Lilith, Boone, Mammon, Leviathan, and so many more as she woke in cold sweat. Eileen thought about the sermon of John Edwards and often found herself dreaming that she was being held over a great furnace of the Christian God's wrath that grew larger and larger, just waiting to swallow her whole. She was terrified to go to a church and to open herself that much further to a path of damnation, to account for the sins that she had partaken of since leaving the church. She sought the counsel of a tarot card fortune teller instead, who looked at her with a look of pity and knowing despair as she pulled the devil, the tower, and the nine of swords in the same reading, a warning that instability and chaos were coming and that she must navigate her life with care, that she was in the depths of life's ferocious grasp and that negativity was feeding on her and that it'd be difficult for her to break free. This feeling plagued her as she forced herself to end her marriage despite her and her husband's happiness together, just in hopes that she would not fall pregnant. She had no way of knowing that she had been cursed by grabbing the ancient book, but the thought of losing a child to someone as merciless as Lamashtu, or to deliver a child that would be taken from her and consumed, was too much for her to bear. Her vast knowledge of the demons weighed on her every night as her dreams became more and more barbaric. She could no longer deny the spiritual realm as she became consumed by her own personal fears of its depths and of its demons and of the wrathful God of Christianity. Every day that she lived, she had no reprieve from the menage of the world that she once denied. She was afraid to live, and she was that much more afraid to die. It would be dreadful to suffer this fierceness and wrath of Almighty God one moment, but you must suffer it to all eternity. There will be no end to this exquisite, horrible misery. When you look forward, you shall see along forever a boundless duration before you, which will swallow up your thoughts and amaze your soul. And you will absolutely despair of ever having any deliverance, any end, any mitigation, any rest at all. Although there were many fortune tellers in New Orleans, Madame L'Orange was the undisputed best. She was in such high demand that the locals refused to speak of their experience with her, as to ensure that visitors from out of town would never come to her. In order to get a reading by Madame L'Orange, one must not only seek her out, but they must also be willing to pay the high price that she demanded. Her name was whispered from local to local. But Madame L'Orange was so elusive that no one, out of a feeling of obsessive devotion to her, would ever state where they found the magic woman who predicted their future. To find her, one had to follow the markings that she left around town. If one was in touch with the spiritual realm, then they would find traces of her magic throughout the city. Most who believed in her power claimed that they could feel her presence like a delicious nectar hanging in the air. Some even believed that all magic in the city must answer to her, and that only the emporiums that she touched could be classified as holding any real power at all, and that the others were mere tourist attractions. If a local thought that they had found Madame L'Orange's divination shop, then they were expected to follow the energy to the place where she lurked within its shadows. If one were lucky enough to find her, she was believed to peer into the depths of their mind, to be able to predict exactly how much money they had on their person and how much they could part with at that moment from the batch. All transactions were cash only, and everyone knew that they had to pay up front, or else they'd be cursed with a worse fortune than they would have had if they had never sought her out. But of course, they all always had money, and they always brought a handsome amount in hopes that offering more would create something bigger for themselves. Any skeptic would assume that offering her so much cash in this manner before she even read the fortune was a money grabbing scheme, but no one who knew a Madame L'Orange and her powers was a skeptic. Every person who had the fortune of stumbling into the realm of Madame L'Orange always had their fortune come true. She always invited in her customers with a warm, inviting smile as she had them enter into her incense perfumed room and take a seat at her tonkatsu table, equipped with a fortune ball in the center, tarot cards, tea leaves, oracle cards, crystals, and runes. She would brew a batch of her specialty tea for the clients after they paid, and would get to know them as they drank deeply from the cup. Once the tea was consumed, Madame L'Orange could make even the most apprehensive and nervous guest feel at ease as they dropped into a trance-like state. Once in that state, Madame L'Orange would grab their cup and she would begin reading the tea leaves. She was well versed in the symbols, more so than anybody else, and she would tell them her own interpretations. If ever challenged, she would look at them with a sympathetic eye and tell them to look deeper than what they thought that they knew. For Madame L'Orange assured them that she was their ultimate guide, And while they were in that state, anything that she said, they believed. Plus, who would ever challenge and think that they knew more than the great Madame L'Orange? They would leave with a fortune in mind, and they would go home, and they would find that whatever it was that she had said, no matter how far-fetched, whether it was immediate, a few months from then, or even a year out, the predictions always came true. Of course, what they refused to acknowledge and what they could not see was that Madame L'Orange was not what she seemed. They thought her a fortune teller, and a good one at that, but no one ever expected that she had a hand in the fortunes. The people would come in, and they would talk to her as they drank their tea, and they became relaxed from the incense of the room and her natural ability to make anybody around her feel at ease. They spilled their guts to her, and she was able to predict what it was that they wanted. For people have a tendency to reveal what is the most important thing to them at the beginning of every conversation. It can be disguised as an intent to get to know the other person, but most of the time, these people would feel so comfortable around Madame L'Orange that they would tell her everything that she ever needed to know about them on the spot. It was easy for her to manipulate her clients. It was easy to get them to talk, and it was easy to understand what could possibly happen next as soon as they left the shop. She knew if somebody was a determined type, if they would leave the door immediately and to go and make it true. She knew if it would take them a little bit to get their affairs in order. And she knew that inevitably, if the person was not someone to take action, that something would fall through with or without their guidance. Of course, she couldn't just rely on the people, however. Her reputation was much better than that. She was not a mere mentalist, but she was a witch as well. She would check in on her clients by hiding in the streets. She knew what they were doing, and her customers, no matter how little they spoke to one another, or at least claimed that they did, her customers all knew each other, and their lives impacted one another's. If she talked to somebody who wanted to get married, and then she would tell the person's partner that they saw wedding bells and their future a year out. If the person did not propose, Madame L'Orange was not going to let that ruin her reputation. She would slip a love potion into the guy's drink the next time that he came in, making him feel so enamored with his girlfriend that he would propose. And she would do little things like that to make the fates reflect what she had read. If a client was particularly rude, one of her favorite things to do, and perhaps one of the skills that she was best at, was the art of the curse. She would tell the person that they were fated to have something terrible happen to them. And depending on how she was feeling that day, it could be something minor, from just tripping and falling and scraping their knee, to having something absolutely wicked happen to them. Some terrible clients had lost limbs. Some suffered from heart attacks. Others were tortured by demons in their sleep until they were eventually driven mad. She had the power to kill. But what would be the fun in that? Shiloh had worked at the same office for years, and she had begun developing casual relationships with the people that she passed in the halls. The conversations were always brief, but they offered a small level of comfort to her that added to her overall desire to stay at the otherwise monotonous job. Of the people that she spoke to the most, she was most friendly towards the members of the custodial staff, who she thought to be the most underpaid and the hardest workers. For them, she was overly nice and extremely sympathetic. When Tomas was assigned to the area that she worked at, she thought nothing of it at first. He was an older, quiet man that simply smiled at her when he grabbed the trash from her cubicle, and then he would leave without saying a word. Eventually, the man began speaking to her, and Shiloh was delighted. They would chat primarily about simple things: the weather, the day of the week in relation to the weekend, and general how do you do's. The conversations were short, but Shiloh could sense that he wanted to share more with her. She began opening up the conversation a bit more in order to encourage the conversation, and she would make a point to ask him about his interests, be it in movies, books, and shows, and about what he did over the weekend. Tomas never really gave her an answer. He would keep it short and would instead change the subject of the conversation to her, urging her to say more about herself and to allow him to get to know more about her. She didn't think much about it at first and assumed that he just did not like talking about himself to her, which was fine and understandable. But as weeks went by, the questions started to make her feel uneasy. Instead of asking her about television or about movies, or anything else simple for that matter, he began asking her very probing and personal questions about her relationships, who she lived with, and if she ever felt unsafe at night. Shiloh was an overly honest person, and she told him that she was single, that she lived alone, and that she lived in a relatively safe neighborhood where she didn't really feel nervous at home alone. He then asked her where she lived, and she gave him an answer, but she couldn't help but to feel a bit uneasy giving him this information. He began lingering in her office for longer periods of time, and he refused to leave, even when she told him that she needed to get back to work. A male employee began to even notice how strange his behavior was, and began coming to her cubicle intentionally each time that Tomas would enter the room. Andrew, her coworker, stayed in her cubicle for as long as Tomas stayed in the area. One time he even stayed as long as an hour before Tomas finally left. They weren't sure if Tomas understood the hint being presented to him, and Shiloh began to feel a sense of paranoia and unease. over the entire situation. She eventually began leaving the cubicle to go to the restroom or to get coffee around the time that Tomas would typically come around to pick up trash. Noticing this behavior, Tomas changed the time of day that he came by, and he did it with such sporadicness that it was hard for Shiloh to guarantee that she would miss him. On Valentine's Day, she came in to work to find a note scribbled on her whiteboard that read, "You will be mine, Valentine." There was no signature, but she knew it was him. She confronted him about it, but he refused to state that he had written it. A few weeks later, when she went on vacation, he texted her to see why she had left him. He asked her questions about who drove her to the airport because he knew that she didn't drive herself since the car was still in the driveway. When she didn't respond, he threatened to break into her house using her spare key that she kept hidden in her garden. Shiloh had never given him this information, and she began to freak out. She texted him back to state that he needed to leave her alone and that she'd report him to the police if her camera saw him break in. He didn't respond for a while, and just when she was starting to feel at ease, her coworker Andrew, now her boyfriend, who had driven her to the airport, called her over a text message that he had received from Tomas. It was a photo of him lying in her bed masturbating. And the caption he wrote said, "You may get to drive her to the airport, but I'm the one in her bed." How he knew that Shiloh did not have security cameras and where she kept her key, she never found out. Andrew had called the police to report a breaking and entering, but there was no trace left behind. Shiloh didn't know what to do. She tried to report the incident to Tomas's boss, but he said that although he felt for her, Tomas was no longer his responsibility, as he had not shown up for work and that he had been fired accordingly. Andrew helped her set up cameras, and she never saw Tomas again. But the thought of him in her bed stuck with her until she eventually had to move states. The town had several old families who had been there since its inception. The streets, the schools, and many of the public buildings were named in their honor. Although they never invited anybody to their homes, these families were active members of the community. They worked in town, they sent their kids to the public schools, and they always showed up to the local events and had a hand in the town politics. The families were incredibly well liked by the town, and because of this, everyone seemed to forget about the rumor of a single mysterious thread that bound the founding families together. It was hard to think of the Henrys or the Colleys or the Lewises as being anything sinister at all. They had such a pristine reputation that their history was completely washed, or at least that's how it was for most of the town. There was an unwritten rule of the town that nobody was to speak of or to study the occult. Two high schoolers, Brian and Emily, did not accept this and Googled the closest curiosity shop, and drove an hour away to visit one weekend. Seeing all of the trinkets on the shelves was a particular delight for them, as they marveled at the oddities within, getting a certain thrill from letting their fingers touch items that they had been told were associated with dark magic, Satan, and witchcraft. Emily was the first to notice the curiously shaped potion bottles and called Brian over to come look with her. The bottles had been filled with pins, needles, nails, and a very questionable liquid that looked like urine. They looked it over carefully, and as they did, they drew the attention of the shopkeeper. Ah, the witch's bottle. It's a curious item, that one. I don't have any thought that it would do any good nowadays, but its history is rather fascinating. Say you ever felt as if you were being cursed, a bottle of your urine, some pins and needles, and some nails buried under the earth should stop it and bring the infliction back on the cursor themselves. This item does not belong to anyone still living, I'm afraid, but it's still something I like to keep for their sake. The poor previous owners tried to lift a curse that had been set on their town by the founders, who were a gaggle of wicked witches. But before they were even able to use the bottle, they were killed. They left the store after a long conversation about curses, witches, and protection, with more curiosity than they had had before entering. They wondered about witches, how they knew that the witch bottle had been made, and how a whole town could be controlled. They wondered about their own town, and how no one seemed to ever leave, and how everyone seemed so miserable, except for the founding families. By the end of the trip, they were completely convinced that the town that they lived in was the one that the shop owner had talked about, and that all the founding families were witches. Sure as they were in their theory, a few questions still remained. How had they been found out? And who killed them? They began researching the town's history and found out that the same families who were in control now had controlled the town since its inception. But there was one family that was missing: the Vincents. The Vincents were there with the Henrys, the Duncans, the Colleys, and the Lewises. But unlike the others, they weren't still in town. Brian and Emily didn't think that this was a coincidence. The Vincents were probably the ones killed who had tried to use the witch bottle. And if that were true, then that meant that the whole town was founded by witches. They wondered how long a curse could last and tried to visit the shop again, only to discover that it had been set ablaze. The fire had been recent, and they could see the paramedics loading a body whose face was covered with a sheet into the ambulance. When they made it back to their car, the windows had been smashed in, and a severed hand was in the driver's seat. "What should we do?" asked Brian. Emily considered the hand for a moment that was currently wrapped in a fist, and they ultimately decided that it would be best to pry open the hand to make sure that there wasn't anything inside of its grasp. They pried open the hand and they found a handwritten note that was folded around a collection of nails, needles, and pens. The note read, "To destroy the coven, one must find the head." Brian and Emily weren't sure what to make of the note, but the head, as they discovered later, was missing from the shopkeeper's body. Them reporting that they had found the hand only raised suspicions on Brian and Emily's involvement in the shopkeeper's death. And although the hand was their only connection to the scene of the crime, the circumstantial evidence and the influence of the founders was enough to sway the jury that Brian and Emily were guilty of the death of the shopkeeper, Vera Vincent. And so the story goes.
Have you ever felt such an unnerving amount of anxiety pulsating through your thoughts, drifting down to your hands, making you want to rip off your own flesh? You try to push past it, but suddenly your hands are rubbing your face with ferocity. You realize what you're doing. You're in public. You know you shouldn't be rubbing your face, so you let your hands move onto your neck. You're rubbing the back of your neck with your hand, slowly curling your hands slightly so your claws can begin to dive into your exposed flesh, digging a little deeper and deeper as your nails create red marks across your skin. You can feel all the nervousness in your stomach as you scratch away. You let yourself stop and revel in the slightly stinging pain that your nails left. You want more. The skin has to come off. You know you do not belong in this prison of your own substance. You feel an itch overcome your entire flesh, and you isolate yourself in a private space to begin scratching the face and body attached to your ever pounding heart. You don't care if you bleed, you just want to escape. Albeit, I was never particularly one for any sense of normality, and the already established abnormality began slipping into a sense of madness when I was about 12, on a weekend away with my parents. My family and I had gone away for a weekend to the city. The city was massive, and it created new fuel for my already extensive sense of creativity and wonder of the world. I saw stories all around me, people from all unique backgrounds living and breathing the same air, but living completely different lives. I wanted to explore each person, follow them, and get to know their story. I imagined that some of the cars in the streets were actually government agents spying on those around, that the people dressed weird were actually carnies trying to blend into the real world, and that the older Goths were actually creatures from another world temporarily in ours. I think the people that intrigued me the most were the beggars on the street. I imagined them as wizards posed as dirty people, waiting to give a token or words to start the right person on their quest. Because of this, I went up to as many of them as I could. One actually gave me a black marble, but when I tried to ask him what it meant, he just winked at me. My mother saw me interacting with him, and she quickly dragged me away and scolded me for talking to him, and that he was not worthy of my time. I kept the marble in my hand while we walked to the family car, and then I placed it in my pocket as I scrunched into the car and into the seat between the two of my brothers as Dad started the engine to ensure that I would not lose it. The trip home was about 3 hours, and conversations were buzzing all around me. But the only thing I could think was why I was chosen to receive the marble. I didn't dare take the marble out of my pocket until I could be sure that no one would take it or ask me about it. But I could feel it against my leg. It felt as if it was much larger than when I had initially held it, and I was eager just to get home. I slipped into a slight slumber, dreaming of the journeys that I might take. I was in a bar when suddenly an old enemy snuck up behind me and stabbed me in the leg. Before I could take any action, there were more men, and all of them were stabbing me at once with daggers. The pain pierced through my body, and I thought that I wouldn't be able to breathe because the pain was so intense. I woke up screaming from the pain, but the pain was not gone. In fact, it felt worse than it had when I was still asleep. "Are you okay, baby? What's wrong?" I could hear Mom asking, but I wasn't able to answer her or comprehend what I was feeling. We pulled up to a corner market store for medication, but it barely helped. For the rest of the drive, I could not stop feeling the pain, and I felt like it might just kill me. We made it the rest of the trip home and went to my doctor. He did his examination and was told that I was looking pretty grave and that we would have to go to the emergency room. I remember the intensity of that pain, which scarcely compared to the horror that greeted me when I awoke on the hospital gurney so many years ago. The main lights in the room had been turned off, and the only source of light came from an operation light swinging violently above my head. The light cast shadows through the room, and I could see people in green scrubs and green masks staring at me with scalpels in their hands. The heart rate monitor next to my bed began buzzing loudly as my heart rate increased to reflect the horror I was facing. The people in masks dripped more liquid into the IV bag, and soon I was asleep again. I woke up once again to a dark room, but this time there was only a single lamp on in the room. I let my eyes adjust to the dark before looking around the room. Then I noticed something that I could not grasp. I tried to rack my brain to ensure that I was actually awake and not just having a nightmare, because there, where part of my leg should have been, there was only emptiness. It took me a while to get used to the idea that I no longer had a leg. I was 12, for fuck's sake. If I thought of myself before this moment as a loner, someone that could not fit in well with society, I am certain that my perception was far off to how I felt at that moment. I had to use crutches, and no one wanted to be around me. I was constantly made fun of, and there was nothing that I could really do about it, considering I could only balance myself on one leg. Tragedy in its forms separates you from those around you. I felt older, more mature than my peers, and I did not feel as if I could relate to them. I was lucky to have family that supported me, but I still felt alone. My life turned into a messy array of doctor's appointments after doctor's appointments. I received new answers about my legs, and my legs seemed worse for the wear. I think this was probably why I began to become obsessed with the grotesque and body horror. I had already lived through my tragedy, and it felt almost relieving to see someone else being tortured and going through that agony. My way of thinking about my world was shaped as I always felt like I was different than those around me, and not just because I was missing a limb. I found ways of expressing myself through music and stories created by the greatest literary minds, and I fell into a sort of rhythm of my own that seemed to stand out from those around me. Although this is cliche, I felt as if I were on my own island, something unreachable and intangible. I often found myself lying in bed at night, fantasizing of universes and how much I would like to be a lone pioneer exploring their chasms. It had been a few years since my abnormalities had surfaced, and I had let myself become a little bit more grounded. I began college, began entering the dating scene, and let my confidence build as I expanded my universe to those within my grasp. Unfortunately, although I tried to blend in, I still could not escape the feeling that I was meant to be alone, and that I was not good enough to continue on the path that was expected of me. My parents were sticklers for the traditional route of college: marriage, kids, death, and they would expressly let their disappointment be known when I flunked out of school and did not seem to have any practical motivation in life from their perspective. I felt depressed, and I tried for years straight to constantly wash all of the humanness of emotions away until I eventually could find myself so void of any dream that I could become a mindless drone. I snapped out of the situation just in time for another attack upon my body. This time, a tumor had grown on my leg, and I had to get it cut out completely. I was working for my grandfather at the time, and I took this as an opportunity to stop living the life expected of me. The recovery time was 2 years, and in that time I felt as if I could really concentrate on the inner workings of my mind. However, instead of the thoughts seeming organic and refreshing, I began to hate what I was. My anxiety began to flare, and I kept having visions of black spots, tumor like in nature, appearing all over my body, and I would wake with claw marks all over my skin from where I had tried to tear them off in my sleep. Because I was not working, I was beginning to lose sense of reality once again. I felt the shame that I had on the trip home from the city almost 20 years ago, where my dreams were becoming indicators of real life pain and circumstances. The horror movies and body horror films I had been so intrigued by for years began to feel real. I could always see a mangled woman on my stairwell creeping her way towards me. Her limbs were distorted and she had a wide smile on her face that was completely covered in boils. I kicked her once and was later asked if I remembered kicking the dog down the steps in the middle of the night. The black spots appeared out of nowhere on my body, and I kept trying to get them out. I could tell what they felt like now, and my mind was convinced that the only way to get rid of them was to continuously tear at them as they encroached. There used to be something that I could see in the corner of my eye each time that I closed the medicine cabinet, but the image had disappeared as quickly as it came. I dismissed it as another hallucination, only to discover that there was a reflection in my own eyes of some creature, black and stirring. I began to do rituals and to train my brain to stay focused and sharp in order to prevent myself from seeing any more of these hallucinations. I needed to get out of the house, and I needed to get a job. I began working for a company part time, and it seemed to help to leave the house. I began talking to a girl and started going over to her place more often. I thought I was doing okay, but any time that I slacked on my training because of her, something would occur. I began seeing the woman on my girlfriend's staircase as if she followed me to that place. One night when I was brushing my teeth, my eyes looked completely black. I called her in to the bathroom, but she did not seem to notice anything off and went back to bed. As she left, I looked once more, and my pupil had completely covered my iris, and the white that would surround it had turned red instead. I tried to rub my eyes and hope for the best, but as I did, my eye drooped down and my eye fell in my hand. I yelled that I was going to shower as I stumbled into the room. I began the water in the shower, but all that poured out was blood. I knew that something was wrong with my brain, but I could not determine what it was. As I took off my prosthetic, a swarm of bees emptied from within its hollow basin and began swarming and eating at my eye on the bathroom sink. "Are you okay?" she came in, asking. The sight of her made me feel back at ease. The blood in the shower had returned to water, and there was no longer an eye on the counter. She helped me sit up, and she asked me what was wrong. I knew I could not explain to her any of what had just happened, so I just shrugged. I took my shower and began to feel okay once again. I went over to the sink, but it made me want to hurl. My skin and muscles were loosely hanging from my face, and I could only see thick black eyes staring back at me. I tried to move everything back into place, but the motions I was taking only made things worse. I could hear a voice inside my head yelling at me to just take it off. And so in my girlfriend's bathroom, I began to tear off the pieces of rotting skin barely clinging to my face. I took off every inch with diligence as my body began to shake. As I took off the last of the skin that surrounded my only eye still intact, a black marble fell out of my eye and shattered on the tiled floor. I cautiously moved my face upwards towards the mirror, and there my reflection smiled back at me. A body of an alien that had been growing inside a human flesh finally had been born. As I slept, I had a dream, and in that dream I was an observer, watching my own body as it slept. I watched my body with fascination, the way I slept, the way I murmured incoherently, and the way I tossed and turned. Moments went by before I realized what the murmurs were saying. I felt a chill wash over me. My body before me was crying out for help. Cautiously, I moved forward so as to not disturb myself further. My voice grew louder as I approached, and I heard it scream. My back! There's something wrong with my back! Staying cautious, still, I pulled the comforter from my body and saw a horrific sight. My back had broken open, and from that spot two thorny vines were climbing up my spine. I tried to grab them to make them stop, but the vines were stronger than me and continued their ascent towards my neck, paying neither of us any mind. A different plan was needed, so I shook my body frantically in hopes that I could help it wake from its nightmare. But still the horror did not stop. As I watched in desperation, my eyes opened in a fury, looking up at me in fear. His voice screamed out, "Why are you doing this to me?" Exasperated and confused, I tried to explain to my body that I was not the enemy, and that I needed its help. I told it that there was a disconnect between us, and that only working together would fix the problem at hand. My body called me a traitor, as the vines and thorns dug themselves deeper into my neck, suffocating it. When this happened, I began to feel a tightness around my own neck, as I began to gasp for air. The room began to grow dark around me, as the red, glowing clock of my alarm read that it was 4:15. Sunlight illumined the room as I heard my alarm bell ring. What a dream, I thought, as I slowly got out of bed. My body ached as I walked across my hardwood floors into the adjoining bathroom. When I went to wash my face, a sudden sense of terror rushed over me, for the reflection staring back had red scratches down its neck. My trembling fingers traced the lines etched upon my flesh. As they traced, I felt a wave of relief rushing over me. A fresh force of laughter broke into my lips as I began to realize that it really had all been a dream. Due to the circumstances in the dream, I must have scratched at my skin, for the marking felt like my own doing. Feeling significantly better, I jumped into the shower and found the other source of concern, a sizable knot in my lower back. As I showered, I thought to myself, enough is enough. Today is the day that you get yourself a new mattress. I called in a personal day at work as I dressed myself in a turtleneck sweater. The wind hit at my skin, and I rode my bike to the only mattress store in town. The store was small, but I was able to find something comfortable that I thought could help with my aches and pains. I was the only customer, so I was able to speak candidly about my problems with the store clerk. My feelings of optimism only soared higher when the clerk himself offered to give my mattress and I a ride back to my apartment. The day eventually turned to night, and I was eager to get to sleep. The mattress was soft, and it quickly allowed me to drift into sleep. Around 4:45, a sound woke me up. I tried to move, but the effort deemed itself futile. I lie still in my bed, watching for any movement and listening for any other sound. That was when I saw it, the figure in the shadow. I could sense the figure watching me in the corner of the room. I tried to speak to it, but I was unable to find my voice. Unnerved by the situation, I tried to scream, but still no sound would come. My back, my neck, and my head ached, but there was no comfort to be found. The figure slowly moved from its spot within the shadows. His eyes were red, and there were two curled horns protruding from the top of his skull. He looked at me, and I heard his voice as it echoed in my ears. The transformation is almost complete, and soon you will be one of us. Why are you doing this to me? I cried, as the pain became more than I could bear. My alarm clock went off at 6 a.m., and so began my morning routine. As I brushed my teeth, I tried to recall the strange dream that I had had the night before, but nothing could come to mind. I examined myself in the mirror, and I was relieved to see that all markings on my neck were gone. My back was still a little sore, but even that pain had significantly subsided. Realizing that I had forgotten my bike at the mattress shop, I frantically got dressed and walked out the door without showering or eating breakfast. The weather was crisp, but I paid it no mind. It was interesting to see my commute from a different perspective. I passed several people on the commute, but the school children stood out the most. I caught several of the children whispering amongst themselves as they pointed my way, while other groups of them seemed to pick up their pace. The thought never occurred to me that something could be wrong until I passed a mother and her daughter. The daughter looked scared, and the mother was shielding her from sight. I strained my ears to listen, and as they walked off, I could hear the girl say, "Mommy, why does that man have horns?" I looked around me to see the man myself, but I saw no one. I began to feel nauseous as my imagination went haywire, imagining some nightmarish creature lurking behind me. I picked up my pace until I was outside of my office building. I sat down on the brick fence in order to allow myself to catch my breath. Surely, I reassured myself, this had to have been a prank of some kind that the children had created. Plus, I would have seen the creature myself if it were following me. Feeling better, I let my mind wander as I waited to go inside. Leisurely, I ran my fingers through my hair until my fingers hit twin knots.